This week on Waterways, Ospreys of South Florida and the invasive exotic Australian pine. The osprey, sometimes called the fishhawk, are common in the Florida Keys. One can see them nesting on power poles along coastal highways or perching on channel markers as they tear into a freshly caught fish. The life of the osprey is tangled up with the life of its prey and the health of the waters it fishes. When an osprey dies, it's up to scientists like Brian Mealey to figure out what, if anything, it might mean about the bays and coastal creeks where it lives.
This chick was not healthy, died on its own, and the adults left the area. We just don't know. And these are kind of the hard things, but we'll be looking for mercury.
Brian knows there's a lot of mercury in Florida Bay. When he finds a dead bird, it's one of the first things on his mind. For reasons scientists do not understand, eastern Florida Bay is a Gulf of Mexico region hotspot for mercury. It has the experts confounded. The other hotspot is near a Texas Superfund cleanup site, whereas the bay is near no obvious major source of mercury or pollution. Brian is helping managers to understand the mercury mystery by studying fish-eating birds.
We never put that up. Where did that come from? If that osprey nest over there is active, I don't see it. Yeah, just go underneath that branch. The ospreys are probably, as a species, they're a lot more sensitive to changes in the environment. And one of the reasons for that is they're very food specific. They're piscivorous, they're piscivores, only like to eat fish. Rarely do you see them eating anything else.
Mercury percolates up the food chain, passing from insects and invertebrates to fish eaters like the osprey. At each step in the food chain, mercury bioaccumulates or becomes more concentrated. This is because an animal like an osprey will eat many times its body weight in fish during its lifetime, and the mercury from all of those fish stores up in the osprey's tissue.
We're going to kind of blow into the nest a little bit. There she goes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Brian studies not only dead birds, but as many birds as he can.
And what we'll do is just kind of place them on the bottom of the boat over here. Actually, in that front seat. Actually, get one at a time. Better? How's the crop? Let me see that crop.
Chicks are best, since they haven't yet learned to fly and can't get away from researchers.
This is the Osprey nest. This is one of the islands that we have a lot of ground nesting there. Basically, there might be a small shrub here that looks like a maypan, and they kind of build their nest structure with these dead twigs. And this is basically what you look at. We're looking at right now are 3 eggs, and you know these are osprey eggs because they're a brown model with a lot of brown. You can see the different variations on them. We felt them, and she's been incubating them. They are warm.
Ospreys usually lay about 3 eggs, of which typically 2 will hatch. After hatching, the osprey is full grown and flying within 55 days. It takes a lot of fish for a hatchling to grow that fast, to become fully feathered, ready to survive, ready to hunt. Osprey parents are not as easily disturbed as some birds. When Brian makes contact with a nest, the parents watch from a distance, but will not abandon the nest. Osprey parents spend about 30 days incubating their eggs, and another 2 weeks feeding the chicks. This process will not be interrupted by the researchers' brief contact with the chicks. Only researchers with a valid permit and with experience handling birds can visit nests. Ospreys are protected by federal and state laws. It is forbidden to disturb their nests. It is against the law to possess any parts of the bird. It is even forbidden to collect their discarded feathers. Brian is very much aware of the responsibility that comes with handling birds.
If we just sit out there and just look at these birds and count these birds and count the babies, it's not going to give you the true picture. So the invasiveness we do, and we do it with extreme care. Very, very careful. Again, mortality is not an option. We're just going to ban him for future reference. Goes in. The reason we have two codes out here, essentially anything on the east side of the bay will have the red, and anything on the west side of the bay wears a green. Or some people say yellow, but I still say it's a green. And the purpose for that is, so far what we have seen is these birds are showing natal site fidelity, the ones that have been with red bands. Matter of fact, one of those parents right there should have a red band on her. This bird shows up again, we'll be able to detect that number.
The bands will tell Brian where the birds start and end their migrations. He has also fitted two birds with satellite tracking devices in cooperation with Mark Martell of the Raptor Center of the University of Minnesota. These devices will tell researchers where the birds are roosting and feeding.
Tips of the feathers, what we call have a half moon marking. They're brown with a white tip. That's a designation as a first year bird. Next time it molts, it won't have that anymore. It'll just be a dark feather. But right now they have all these half moons. And the other thing is, as young birds, he's dying to bite me, is you can see the eyes there, the iris is primarily orange. As they mature, it gets bright yellow. So that's another way of telling it's an immature bird. These animals are a fish specialist. They're getting their mercury where same place where humans get it is from the fish. So the question is, how is this affecting the osprey population in Florida Bay? Unknown. The only thing we have results so far, it fluctuates. So we've had other students come out from FIU, Florida International, and they're actually doing some feather studies, and they're trying to set up a formula that will compare the feather levels with the blood levels and how do they correlate and how can we start looking at this.
Mercury, or liquid silver as the ancients called it, is found in the rocks below our feet, in the sea, and even in the air we breathe. Under natural conditions, it exists in such low concentration that it has no effect upon people or animals. But, in recent times, we've put more mercury into circulation. We dug it out of the ground and made batteries and medical supplies. When we dispose of these things in waste incinerators, we let mercury loose into our air and waters. When mercury enters soils at the bottom of wetlands, lakes, or bays, like those found in the Everglades and Florida Bay, it can change into methylmercury, a very dangerous form of the metal. Methylmercury can race through the food chain. While Florida's strict pollution controls have reduced mercury in other parts of the state, the amount of mercury in Florida Bay is still very high. As of 2005, mercury levels in 5 Florida Bay fish, spotted sea trout, crevalle jack, ladyfish, bluefish, and gaff-top sail catfish exceed what the state of Florida considers safe. If too much of this mercury gets into people, it can damage the nervous system. But this unfortunate baby osprey could have perished for a number of reasons. Florida Bay can be a harsh environment. Maybe food was scarce. Parents will take care of themselves first. And if food is scarce, the babies suffer most.
We were out here about maybe a month and a half ago when they had 2 eggs. So obviously those hatched out. One chick already had not made it. And now we're just remaining with this one chick, you know, who really hasn't been dead. Has probably been dead maybe 3 days, 2 to 3 days. So this is part of the hard part that you come back out here. There is, with ospreys, there is mortality. They're very dependent upon fish. If they cannot find enough fish to feed their young, this is one of the consequences. But there's other factors that can lead to the abandonment of a nest.
Thanks to Brian Mealey and other researchers conducting studies in Florida Bay, resource managers can keep track of surges in mercury levels and attempt to protect ospreys and humans from harm. The Florida Keys is a very unique place. It is here that temperate meets tropical, and hundreds of plant species thrive. However, not all of these plant species are native. There are some that are considered dangerous invaders.
Our natural areas are the most threatened by invasive exotic plants. And that's not your neighborhood bougainvillea plant, it's more something that once you plant it, doesn't stay where it's planted. So of the 1,600 different exotic species in Florida, there's actually only about 62 classified as invasive. So it's a very small percentage of the ones that are really bad for these areas. These are the ones that will jump your back fence and show up in the natural areas and slowly but surely displace the native plants that are there that all of our wildlife depends on.
Exotic plants arrived on our shores by a variety of means. Sometimes it was for industrial reasons. Developers were hoping to harvest hardwood for building materials. Some species were imported in the attempt to retard shore erosion and were used as wind throws to actually protect soil in some of the farming areas on the mainland.
Most of your invasive exotic plants were actually brought over as landscaping plants because in the nursery trade, what do you want? We want something that somebody with a brown thumb can even grow. So something that grows really fast and is hard to kill is something that's actually sought after. Brazilian pepper is a really good example. It was brought in as landscaping, but it actually grows to about 20, 30 feet in a big bramble, which isn't what your homeowner really wants.
In addition to the Brazilian pepper, the Australian pine is considered one of the most destructive plants for our native ecology. When Australian pines grow in an area, they take it over. They grow relatively fast and tall compared to native vegetation, blocking the sun from reaching the other plants. Australian pines quickly create a monoculture and do not allow for diversity. And for a healthy ecosystem, diversity is critical.
Besides how tall they get and the amount of shade they put out, they also, their needles, which aren't even true pine needles, will actually create a blanket on the ground. That does two things. It blocks new plants from coming up shade-wise and structure-wise, but it also, they're a little bit acidic, so it actually makes the ground less hospitable to seeds to germinate. On an area like this at our beaches, they've actually shown that the roots of an Australian pine, because they are much, much different than the small little fibrous roots that are in most of our beach dune communities, they don't actually hold the sand. it actually speeds erosion. So this gets rid of your beach and is a hindrance to nesting for sea turtles.
Alison estimates that there are close to 400,000 acres lost to Australian pines and other invasive exotics in Florida. The havoc caused by the invasive exotics actually contributes more to habitat loss and displacement than human development. To combat this growing problem, the Nature Conservancy's Florida Keys initiative, in conjunction with other state and federal agencies, is eradicating the species. Quite ironic when historically, their mission was to plant trees.
One of the things that the Nature Conservancy is doing right now, we're really lucky. We were just given almost $300,000 specifically to help remove invasive exotics on private lands. We're not going to help you so that you can develop that land, but we do help if you've got an Australian pine towering over your house and you're right next to a public conservation area. We're concerned that it's spreading, and so we can help each other by getting rid of it.
The Nature Conservancy has been successful in removing Australian pines from publicly owned land. However, some people are attached to certain qualities provided by Australian pines and have been reluctant to see them go, regardless of their detriment to the surrounding species.
The division has agreed to allow the adult pines to remain until they're blown over by storms, become a safety hazard, die of natural causes, threaten the structure or anything like that.
The managers of Fort Zachary Taylor State Park met resistance from a small portion of the community when they began removing Australian pines from the park. The shade they provide for the park would be gone with their removal, and it would take many years for native replacements to grow to the same heights. And it is too expensive for the park to buy fully grown trees. Therefore, they compromised by waiting until the present trees were felled by natural causes.
A couple of the things that are magical about the Australian pines to people are, one, it's the filtered light that you get. It's the fact that you can sit under them. Here, there's not many plants, big tall trees that will grow this close to the water. So you actually have this filtered sunlight. You've got a lot of space because they are so tall. That it has allowed, especially here at the park, a big group meeting scene. That doesn't mean that that's not replaceable with native plants.
They don't provide any food source for migratory birds or native animals.
Plants like Brazilian pepper do have the little red berries, and so a lot of your birds or your raccoons will eat them, but it doesn't actually mean that that's good for them. It's kind of like eating a bunch of candy. It's not what their diet has evolved to.
And additional danger is the threat of these large trees uprooting. The Australian pines are very tall, and because of their shallow root system, they can be a hazard to any people congregating around them.
The Australian pines are definitely a safety hazard. They grow, 60, 80 feet tall. They're brittle. They're not really a pine. It's an oak. I've seen them snap in dead calm winds, halfway up the trees.
With increased hurricane ferocity in the past few years, the abundance of Australian pines in the Keys and the rest of Florida could be increasingly dangerous. When Hurricane George struck the Keys as a Category 2 storm, the Keys Energy Services reported that most damage was caused by Australian pines. Cars, houses, power lines, and roads were all compromised from falling Australian pines.
look through the Keys and you're going through our natural areas, if you see one plant standing 20 feet taller than everything else, it's usually an Australian pine. All of our native plants kind of get to top out at about the same height, which I label hurricane height, because there's a certain point with the amount of soil we actually have and the amount of land they can actually grab that you become too top heavy and more susceptible.
While the managers at Fort Zachary Taylor have not been able to convince everyone in Key West about the dangers and problems with Australian pines, other managers at other parks have had great success. At Long Key State Park, just south of Isla Morada, Australian pines once filled about 30% of the park property. Today, through intense efforts and with the help of the locals, they've reduced that number to about 5%.
Long Key is part of a combination of state parks in the Florida Keys that has the same citizen support organization. The citizen support organization calls Friends of Islamorada Area State Parks. It encompasses a number of state parks here in the Keys. And they have been a big supporter of helping us with these, removing these exotics by offering us a log splitter so that we may cut the wood in smaller pieces, split the wood, and then we make this split wood available to the campers so that they can have a campfire.
Currently, the biggest problem for eliminating Australian pines is the lack of access to private property. While the Nature Conservancy and state parks can remove all the Australian pines on public lands, they need an invitation to remove them from private lands. And the trees on private property spread their seeds back into public lands. Even if the Australian pines were totally removed from public lands, this would not solve the problem.
If you're watching this and you know somebody that has an Australian pine or a Brazilian pepper they've been cutting back forever and ever, and especially if you are near some natural areas, that you can contact us at the Nature Conservancy office. We're in the phone book, and call us and we'll talk about it. The way it works, you sign something that says that we're allowed to come onto your yard and work with us, and we get a contractor, professional, licensed, and we'll work with you to get it down safely.
The saying, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure," is the perfect axiom for the problem with Australian pines. Once the state spends money getting the big trees out, it costs far less to keep them out. A fully grown tree that might have taken a week with a chipper and a whole crew only takes 2 hours with one person as a sapling. When these groups reach that maintenance phase, the problem will be much cheaper and far easier.